Hey guys, welcome to Boxing Squad for boxing news and views from around the internet. As expected, top contender Dillian Whyte has come out publicly blasting the WBO for naming Oleksandr Usyk as its mandatory challenger for the winner of the Joshua and Ruiz rematch that's being held later this year. Dillian Whyte was the number one contender in that sanctioning body as well as number one in the WBC. He was a shot potentially to be named the WBO mandatory, but Usyk, courtesy of being the WBO super champion at cruiserweight, has claimed that spot. So Whyte as well has now been dropped, relegated to number 3 in the rankings in the latest update, as I covered in my video yesterday. So he is no longer the number one, doesn't get the mandatory, and is still waiting to see what happens with his potential mandatory shot in the WBC. So it's not all coming up Dillian Whyte at the moment. And he's spoken to TalkSport, venting his frustrations with this all, saying, "If I say what I really feel about these things, I might get removed from the rankings. I start saying stuff and they send me emails and letters saying I can't say these things and it's disrespectful. But the fact that they are disrespecting me constantly doesn't mean anything. Boxing is full of basically, and we see it time and time again." And Whyte goes on to say, "It's a joke. He pulled out of the Takam fight. These guys are jokers. It is what it is. I've got a big fight ahead of me. I just want to focus on that. Rivas is a tough challenger. He's coming to win and he's undefeated. He's never lost before." That's Dillian Whyte's statements to TalkSport. Understandably, Dillian Whyte, who's been ranked as the number one contender in the WBO for 9 months, is understandably disappointed that he's been overlooked on this occasion in favour of Oleksandr Usyk, who put up an application to become the mandatory. It was granted, and despite having that injury to his right bicep, which prevented that Takam fight, as Whyte referenced, he had a medical certificate, he was able to produce it, and obviously the WBO has believed that Usyk is the guy for them to be the mandatory challenger. So effectively, you could probably say that Whyte's chances of fighting for a title in the WBO anytime soon, I mean, outside of a voluntary shot, if any of the champions gave him a voluntary, he's not going to get a mandatory shot anytime soon in the WBO. And also, he's now dropped to number 3 behind Tyson Fury and behind the new number one, Oleksandr Usyk. So I guess the sort of what do we actually expect now? I mean, where does Whyte go from here? I covered some of the history the other day, and Whyte has made some very deliberate choices in his career to prioritize money over title eliminators at different points. He's fought some very good competition, but he hasn't been without opportunities, including one with Anthony Joshua, which he said thanks but no thanks. So he is one of these guys who's got one of the best records of a guy who has not had a title fight. And I was thinking about this with the WBC. If they actually come out, because Whyte has been seeking a resolution from them to give him the mandatory shot should he beat Oscar Rivas, and there's some other sort of caveats that they're looking to have in there, accelerate when Whyte would get a shot against the WBC title holder, whoever that may be at the time that Whyte would get a shot. I mean, even then, really, that seems to be like it would be quite distant. I mean, there's no guarantees that the WBC will grant that acceleration clause, because it does seem like they're on board for a Wilder and Fury rematch. And we've heard just this week that Shelley Finkel, Wilder's co-manager, has sort of shut down talk of a Wilder and Fury rematch happening next, which had been suggested by promoter Eddie Hearn, Whyte's promoter, as something that looked like it could happen. But Finkel has said, no, that's not going to happen. It's going to be Ortiz, then it will be Fury. And will the WBC bend to Dillian Whyte and to Eddie Hearn's will on some of these issues? And it's a big question, because obviously the WBC came out recently a bit het up about some of the comments that Whyte had made, and he sort of referenced that, sending him letters saying, don't say these things, it's disrespectful. But he is also feeling similarly disrespected. So it's, even if they do put the mandatory status on the line, I mean, sort of best case scenario as I see it right now, not knowing all the details on what's going to come out of this resolution, is maybe the back end of next year. And that would mean that he's been sort of chasing a shot in the WBC for the best part of, 2.5, 3 years. He's had scores of fights, sanctioned fights that in the WBC, and that's obviously got him to the #1 contender spot. But it clearly doesn't mean that he's going to get the mandatory shot or the title shot when he wants it. I mean, if he had have had things his way, he would have fought for the belt last year. And that probably was the, very optimistic best case scenario. And people will debate whether Deontay Wilder doesn't want to fight him or whatever. But, I mean, these champions with minimal mandatory obligations at least once a year, and often in the WBC it's been well less than that. Deontay Wilder's only had, 2 and 4 years. So I think it's probably optimistic for Whyte and Hearn to think that it's going to be the back end of this year or early next year. Doesn't really seem like the WBC, which has not bent to their will to any point, to any extent to this point. I can't see them just sort of caving now and going, okay. And Eddie Hearn has sort of indicated publicly, almost like a veiled threat to the WBC. Look, if you don't give us what we want, we're going to take a serious legal position, that they believe they have a good case. Dillian Whyte, they don't believe that he's maybe had some of the treatment that he should have had, and he said that the WBC is pretty much on notice if things don't sort of fall their way. But often these things can be hot air and, empty promises of taking action because in some respects, if he takes legal action against the WBC, he'd be cutting off his nose to spite his face. It's going to probably have the opposite effect to what they would like it to have. In the interim, while things are in protracted, legal arguments and negotiation and, conference, these things could drag out for some considerable time. And is he better off in that scenario? Possibly not. I mean, he might ultimately get a ruling in his favour if they sort of push things that far, but, he could lose 2 years of his career. And in the end, I mean, isn't he wanting to solidify a title shot? And he wants to push for a mandatory shot now in the WBC, so to some extent, he's just got to try stay the course. It may not necessarily be fair, but I mean, that's boxing. There has been a lot of comments in recent comment sections where Whyte's name has come up saying that he and his promoter Eddie Hearn have been trying to dictate terms too much. And I think the sanctioning bodies, clearly, from what we've seen, do not like to be dictated to. They want to be the ones that, even though they're seriously bent and not consistent, the only consistent thing is that they are seriously inconsistent most of the time. But it's like Whyte trying to push Deontay Wilder on some of these things. The harder he pushed for a fight, the more Deontay Wilder said, "I'll make you wait." And that kind of seems like what the WBC has been doing. But yeah, I can't, outside of voluntaries, it's hard to see where does he go from here, because Usyk in the WBO, we know that Deontay Wilder in the WBC has a number of fights lined up, Ortiz and then potentially Tyson Fury. Outside of that, what does he do? I mean, the IBF, he's not ranked in there because he turned down a final eliminator against Kubrat Pulev mid last year. So the WBA, well, maybe that's an option. We'll have to see what happens, because he wants a title fight somewhere, and I guess, sometimes money talks, and some of these things where he knows his commercial value too. He wants to be the A side in some of these fights, especially a UK pay-per-view. A guy like, say, Manuel Char, if he was trying to get him, he'd have to seriously overpay him to get that belt, or a similar type of situation for a title that was similarly recognized. So he's in a bit of a tough spot, because there will be guys who want to fight him, but they may not necessarily be those title fights. He may end up having a lot of fights like he's had Joseph Parker, Derek Chisora, Oscar Rivas on pay-per-view. Good money-spinning fights that pay him a premium. He's getting very big purses. He's becoming accustomed to the paydays. But he may not necessarily be advancing his case in any of the sanctioning bodies to get some sort of mandatory shot. He's in a funny place right now. But what do you make of it all? Drop a comment, loud and often. Hit like, hit subscribe, follow me on Twitter, boxing_squared. I'm out.